And welcome, David. Great to connect with you. Been a pivotal part, I think, in South African society, 40 plus years, actually bringing joy to many people's lives, but at the same time subtly giving messages and also being an influence for the good. The underpinning action of what you've done, especially when I was growing up, was that of unity. That was a theme which subtly came through in a very light-hearted way, given the context of the times, and involvement also with District 6 and the adverts of the Foxy Bus adverts. If you could just share a little bit of background of how, what inspired you to, every time somebody writes a song, there's always some sort of inspiration, whether it's a breakup or something, a story in that regard.
Well, I think, when with songwriting and certainly with what I started to do is about having a kind of a philosophy, and so I had to think about identity, because as you kind of almost mentioned, I grew up during apartheid, and apartheid was very much about defining people by the color of their skin, as if skin denoted the sort of cultural group you might fit into. And even as a young person, that didn't quite seem right to me. I couldn't, it didn't fit with the reality that I grew up with. I grew up in the Boerland, small town there, and I had, because my father was in the furniture business, and I had a lot of contact with different kinds of people. So this idea of separate identities didn't really gel for me. And but then I also had the good fortune of going to England. I went to study at the university there, and I was, perhaps at that point sort of thinking, I speak English, I'm kind of English, and you had identified a lot of the music from England and the stories and books and so on, and I kind of just thought, okay, I'm like, not that I was British, but that I speak English. But once I got there, I realized how different I was. I was very, I was different. Even though I spoke English, I realized how South African I was. I spoke South African English, and that my history and my story was completely different to them. And so that was a big motivating force for me in terms of what I wanted to start writing about. And because I was starting to perform at a very left-wing university in Leeds, where I was, I would say that the audience was hostile to what they perceived as white South Africans in those days. So the way around that hostility was to use humor, and I started to satirize some of the situations that I'd found myself in South Africa, and then I found out what a powerful tool and almost weapon humor was, to use comedy and humor, so that you could disarm people, disarm their prejudices by making fun of yourself. So that's where it started for me, and then of course I came back with a whole bunch of songs, and I slowly became more and more famous, and until such time as I released my first record, and then I got those Foxy Bus ads which put me on national television, and then I became kind of a national celebrity. So that was the way I was introduced to South African audiences. But you were asking about the inspiration to the songs, but maybe that explains it to you.
Yes, yes.
Because I mean, each song is different. Each song is a new idea, but it comes out of a philosophy.
And comedy being an important part of our lives, because one of our needs is happiness,
Yeah.
human needs, and that's through comedy.
But I didn't only write in a comedic way. I mean, maybe you might just remember me for some of the comedy. I certainly played a comedic character, and that, in a sense, was quite. It was difficult for me because I found myself trapped in my own success. I found myself, as far as the public was concerned, I needed to be this funny guy, you know, with the red shoes and the bicycle and all of that stuff, and always, you know, very much the Joker. You know, I needed to play the Joker, and yet a lot of my work was quite serious. There was a lot of kind of political influenced social commentary songs, and so that confused people to a large extent, you know, that I was funny on the one hand, didn't take me seriously, and then suddenly if they came to my concerts, they would be confronted by fairly serious topics, which is probably why I left that arena and moved into writing the first musical, District 6, about forced removals. It was a political issue, a terrible part of our Cape history, the forced removal of all those thousands and thousands of people from District 6 in Cape Town. And so I wrote that with the late Tally Peterson, and that just took me into a completely new direction and allowed me to do more kind of songwriting styles.
In the Boerland where you grew up, that was Worcester specifically.
In Worcester, yes.
Yeah. So growing up in the Boerland, the District 6, that wasn't something that you grew up.
No.
Was
no.
an awareness
I didn't
later
grow
in
up
life?
with District 6. Talib grew up in District 6, but of course, I used my imagination and I researched the subject, and I spoke to many people who had lived there, and Talib was very much an informant. So I don't believe you have to come from a place to write about it, or you don't have to be a person to write about their experience, you know. I mean, so the creative work that I do, and a lot of creative people do, is very much a leap of imagination and empathy with the subject and the people that you're writing about. Yeah.
Yeah, it's about
So that also confuses people perhaps a little bit. Like, how can you, write about characters who lived in District 6? Well, if you use your own experience and your imagination.
empathy.
Yeah, and empathy. Yeah, but your own experience you bring to the characters, and people, apart from their superficial their superficial cultural identity, people all over the world are the same. You know, they all fall in love or
We all have the same emotions.
get anger. Yeah, they're all the same emotions and the same kind of motivations. You know, people all want the same kind of things at the end of the day. They might just express them. One expresses it in Japanese and the other one in Afrikaans.
When you say that people expected something different when they saw you, and they soon realized that you actually had a very strong, everything you did, there was a strong message, but it was just making it palatable, and so not to offend, but to get your message across. Was that?
Yeah, but it wasn't so much trying to get a message across. I think what I was doing, and what I almost do every time, is an exploration of something that might be troubling me. So the work that I do is to explore, to find answers for the questions I'm asking myself. Okay, so that I always felt my songs were the answers to the questions that were bumping around in my head. And so when you heard that song, it was some kind. It was an expression of that solution that I found. If the audience could identify with that and find a message in it, then fine. But my intention was not to kind of convey a message. My intention, as I say, was very much self-exploratory.
Your own journey.
And it remains that, so even when I write a musical today, it's because the subject intrigues me. I want to know more about it. I want to try and understand why did these people do what they did in this particular place and time. So that leads you to all kinds of things. I mean, I wrote a musical called Orpheus in Africa, which was a very interesting story about an African-American singing group. They sang the old Jubilee songs, and they came to South Africa in 1890. And I still found a photograph of them, dressed up in Victorian clothing, top hats, and and I was fascinated to see this photograph and like, who were these people? Why were they dressed like that? What were they doing in South Africa? So immediately there, I'm confronted with a different reality of something that happened in Cape Town and in South Africa all those years ago. And so I start to explore that idea. And through that exploration, I create a work.
And slightly off topic, but something personal on yourself. When you were growing up, did you also explore, I mean, during your developmental, the sense of identity, and was that something that came later when you went to Leeds, or were you already aware of that when you were growing up? I mean,
I think when as a teenager, I could sense that there was something, that it was not right. I could sense that the world, the way the politicians were presenting it, and the laws that they were telling us that we had to, that all the separation, like, so you went, everything was for whites, white schools, white cinema, all those kind of things, white churches, and then on the other side of the road, lived the colored people, and outside of town lived the black people, and yet in everyday life people were mixing. People worked together, like in my father's shop, people worked together. They were a team of mixed people, and yet the government was saying no, we shouldn't be together. So I understood that as a teenager, but I don't think I could really. I wasn't able to kind of analyze it at that point until I became a student at university, and I started to see, when you look back at where you've come from, you start to see how mad, it was just mad. We were being told that this asylum that we were living in was normality. That's what I realized when I was 20 years old, that I'd grown up in a mad world, which people kept telling me was normal. This is
it was the early 80s.
Yeah, and the early in the 60s and the 70s. I was born with apartheid. Apartheid came into being in 1948. Although it's out of our history, but I mean, we've had this for hundreds of years. But racial discrimination.
I knocked 10 years off your age.
Yeah. So I was born in the 50s.
Yes.
And so I saw it all. The worst of apartheid in the 60s and the 70s, and then it started to crumble in the 80s.
Yeah, so you would have been pre-teens when we became a republic, breaking from the Commonwealth.
Probably, yeah.
And these days, songwriting, are you still involved with songwriting and performing?
I don't perform anymore. I stopped performing recently, saying I won't ever do it again, but I'm still writing. At the
For
moment,
yourself or for other song?
No,
artists?
I write musicals. I write for the theatre. So for the last 35 years, my main focus has been on creating musical theatre, in which many people participate. In between, I wrote songs for myself and released some albums, but never at the level of my early success. I mean, I was very successful as David Kramer, the comedian, in the early 80s, from 1981 until 1986. And then I moved into musicals, and that has been my main focus right up until now. And currently, I'm working on a new project, which I hope will be on stage in April next year. Yeah.
The Baxter Theatre?
No, it's going to the Oudtshoorn and KAK&K, the Klein Karoo Nasionale Kunstefees. So it starts there, and it's like it's for the festivals, yeah, it'll be in Afrikaans and English, dual language piece of work.
I think the Royal Hotel will always be a classic.
Thank you. It still is sung today, and
Powerful.
People do remember that, and I mean, when they see me in the streets, they'll say, "You said him, man." As you said, some of these things have become part of the language, and
sure.
Isadimana is certainly one that hasn't been forgotten. Yeah, but there were a few songs, and another one is Stoksila Leen, that people, Stoksila Leen op 'n Saterdag aan. So yeah, people, fortunately for me, those songs have become kind of classics, evergreens,
Now I remember that period. There was also Jeremy Taylor.
Yes, before me.
But there was that advert with the T around that period as well.
Yeah, but he was. But when he was.
Oh yes, when your famous was before that. I was too
he
small.
was in the 50s.
I didn't remember that.
No.
I remember the advert to the T. Then your advert used to come on.
He basically was the forerunner to what I did, because he wrote a song called "Ach Please Daddy." Ach Please Daddy. Yeah, and I was a teenager when that came out. And Des Lindbergh sang "Die Gezoem van die Beye." And so those people influenced me in terms of my songwriting, as to finding my voice. It's about I think what you're talking about, this identity thing, I think of finding your voice, being authentic.
Yes.
Being authentic and not aspiring to something you've seen on television or YouTube, or and imagining that's where it's happening. We kind of, I think what my work was also about was accepting myself, and getting over any kind of inferiority complex. I'm not. I really would like to be, a cool American guy.
James Bond.
Yeah. No, but even just in the music, with like the Californian West Coast sound, the guys who could play guitar, all sang with American accents, and they played American kind of music, or so the cultural influences came from overseas, and we felt we should emulate them, and I think the thing that I did, which was pioneering work, was to say, no, hang on, forget about that. I'm rather going to be me. I'm going to sing like me. I'm going to use my own voice. You might think it's funny or belachelijk. I mean, people were shocked that I should just sing in this flat South African accent. I mean, how ugly can you get? But it was decades ahead of its time.
I think very refreshing.
People were shocked that I should just be prepared to be me and not pretend to be something more sophisticated. That's what it was. It was like not being pretentious, and it's very hard to be that, and especially as a South African, it seems to be very hard. Yet there are, especially I suppose, like let's say white South Africans or brown South Africans. And black South Africans don't quite have that problem.
Sure.
You know, they feel very confident and comfortable in the kind of traditional influence that they have.
Yeah, so
that makes it, so
South Africans abroad, how quickly they change their accents.
Yeah. Pretend they're from Australia.
But for me, when I went, I mentioned earlier that I lived in London, and when I came back, I actually started more South African because I embraced my identity more and more. I went the other way.
Okay.
So it's like that's what resonates to me. What you said about when you were at Leeds University, where you realize that there are differences, and you actually say, "Well, that's me."
And people are not, they're hostile because of a label that you already come with. You come with it. You come from South Africa. They can see that you look like a white South African, and so they think that's who you are. A racist white South African who supported apartheid. So how do you deal with that? I mean, it was a seriously left-wing university, and kind of. Almost what's happening in the last few years with like the woke generation and that. I mean, that I already experienced in the 1970s.
Hey, the last question is, you mentioned about having to, I'm going to use my own word, to overcome. There were certain challenges as well, especially when you were at Leeds and where you were labelled. And just something to share for the next generation, also with this wokeness. And there's so much, I would say, confusion today in terms of role models, because everybody has a mouthpiece now with social media. But what is this universal truth which you could share, or from your own experience, a tip for the next generation? That's something that you overcame, and people could find themselves in a similar situation, and word of advice or wisdom to share.
Yeah, well, I think young people should be very aware of how easily you can be influenced by social media, and lose your empathy for other people, because everybody wants to be right on social media. Everyone's shouting their opinion. Everybody wants to be right, and so it gets vicious if some group or someone becomes a target, so that what seems to happen on social media is that people quickly group together and
close ranks,
become kind of like the lynch mob, so standing out and having your own opinion and being an individual might be more difficult, even though you think you've got this platform. So my advice is develop your empathy, walk in the other person's shoes, try and understand where they've come from and what they've been through before you get too clever and critical because they don't measure up to your values or your privileged situation in life. So that you should, I think that's the best advice I can give. Just empathy is a very healthy thing, and make sure that you know what you're talking about. Before you just repeat what someone else has told you.
Thank you for sharing, and thank you for
Yeah, good, nice talking to you.